Well, I'd like to welcome everyone to tonight's presentation. First of all, I'd like to begin by acknowledging with respect that the land on which we gather here virtually tonight is within the traditional territories of the Lekwungen, Esquimalt, and Songhees nations, Malahat, Wasanich, Chianu, Sayak, and Pachidat peoples whose historical relationships with the land continues to this day. So thank you for coming to tonight's event, Media and Contemporary Society. My name is Farley Cates. I am the co-organizer of CFIC Victoria Branch. CFIC is Canada's only national nonprofit with a mission of promoting and educating the public on critical thinking, science, and secularism. We help people make decisions based on evidence, rational thinking, and compassion. In alignment with our mission, we hold events like this to provide an opportunity for subject matter experts, intellects, and free thinkers to engage with you. Most recently, we have moved many of these events, obviously, online during the COVID-19 pandemic. So to minimize background noise, we will be putting everyone on mute. If you wish to speak, please raise your hand. You'll be acknowledged. And you can either raise your hand or you can write your name down or put a comment in the chat window. You'll be unmuted when the opportunity presents itself for you to ask your question. CFIC relies on donations and memberships to allow us to bring you events such as the one you have seen tonight. Please visit our website or email us for more information about how to become a member or to make a donation to CFIC. I'd like to thank as well, before I introduce tonight's speaker, I'd like to thank the University of Victoria Speakers Bureau, which provides speakers on numerous topics. And we use that to draw many of our speakers from for this series annually. So without further ado, I'd like to present Ms. Shreyashi Ganguly, who will talk on media in contemporary society. By way of an introduction, Shreyashi is a graduate student at the University of Victoria, currently pursuing her second master's degree in sociology. Prior to joining graduate school in Canada, she worked as a journalist at an English daily in India. It's here that she was made aware of how media controls everyday life and how the media in turn is controlled by the big corporations and the state. This has partly shaped her research interests. Currently, in her MA research, she's exploring how English stand-up comedy on the internet in India discriminates against certain minority groups. She's trying to understand how social media essentially facilitates marginalization and oppression of minority concerns. She's also trying to understand the broader socio-political processes that inform the way media understands minority issues. In her talk today, she'll try to provide an understanding of the effects of media in everyday life without making it too theory-centric. She'll aim to explain how the culture we live in is mediated. This means that culture today is essentially made up of the messages media offers us. To explain this, she'll begin with 3 theories on media and explain their significance with the help from the contemporary Canadian context. So without further ado, Shreyashi, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's presentation, and I turn the floor over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me here tonight. It's an absolute pleasure to speak to all of you tonight. As you might have already gleaned from the posters and also Mr. Kate's introduction, tonight I will be talking to you about media and its role in contemporary society. I acknowledge that this topic is too vast and perhaps too complex to be possibly covered in one session. So my attempt is to discuss some aspects of the function of media in our everyday lives and help explain them with examples from the current political context. like Mr. Cates mentioned, I am from India and I've also worked as a journalist there. So my arguments will sometimes also be inspired from the Indian political context. Essentially, my aim is to place this discussion against a global backdrop. Just to reiterate what already has been said, just to give you a brief idea of what this presentation entails, over the course of the next several minutes, I will walk you through some basic ideas about media, its more current manifestation in the digital age, the social media. I will try to discuss how the culture we live in is essentially mediated, meaning that it is becoming increasingly difficult to separate media technologies from our lived realities. I will take recourse to some sociological theories without making it too theory centric to problematize the relationship between humans and media further. Thereafter, my goal is to try and delineate the positive and negative attributes of media. I will attempt to do this with the help of examples from some key current global events unfolding right at this moment, just south of the border. At the very outset, I would like to preface this presentation by saying that I do not hold any great expertise on this subject. My analysis comes from my background in sociology, my current research interests, and some level of personal involvement with the media as a former journalist. I realize that there are many aspects I might have missed out on while preparing this talk, and I would be interested in hearing your opinions on them. I look forward to a lively and engaging discussion. So, let us begin with the basics first. I'll begin by talking a bit on about what we understand by the media. What exactly is it do we mean when we say media? Defined most simply, media are the technologies that enable information to be shared instantaneously and simultaneously with many millions of people almost anywhere around the world. Commonly referred to as mass media because they communicate to a mass audience comprised of very large numbers of people. This includes a wide variety of forms such as television, newspapers, films, radio, video games, and the internet. In contemporary times, it is crucial to distinguish old forms of media from the new media. Old media can largely be understood to be the traditional sources of information such as magazines, television, radio. However, the term new media came into prominence in the mid 1990s. The singular plurality of the phrase stemmed from its negative definition that it was not mass media. It's fluid, individual connectivity, a medium to control, and also a medium for freedom. Although new media depended heavily on computerization, it is not simply digital media. By that, I mean that it is not digitized forms of other media, but rather an interactive medium or form of distribution as independent as the information it relays. Many scholars discourage the compartmentalization of media into the old and new, arguing that the new should be thought of as a continuation of the old. But the fact remains that new forms of media have revolutionized interpersonal communications and seep to the basic essence of what is meant by everyday living. It would be, however, fallacious to think of the media in all its forms as stationary and or unchanging. Media is dependent on technology, and technology, with its relentless upgrades, is constantly renovating itself. In the process, it also renders a dynamic character to media itself. Canadian media theorist Marshall McLuhan argued that electronic media tends to create a global village in which people throughout the world see major events unfold and hence participate in them together. The media promotes a feeling of interconnectedness and a sense of global kinship. These virtual communities consist of public discussions with sufficient human feeling but in a disembodied setting, like the one we are participating in it currently. Over the last few decades, these key areas of human existence have converged in and through our concurrent and continuous exposure to, use of, and immersion in media. Research shows that more of our time gets spent using media and that multitasking on media has become a regular feature of everyday life. It is important to mention here that it would not be totally correct to conceive of the media as just types of technology and chunks of content we pick and choose from the world around us. What I mean by this is that the media are not external agents affecting us in various ways. If anything, today we have to recognize how the uses and appropriations of media penetrate all aspects of contemporary life. This has been labeled as a Mediapolis. By that, I mean a mediated public space where media underpin and overarch the experiences and expressions of everyday life. We live our lives through media instead of with it. Another term, media ecology, comes to mind, often used to refer to the nature of our existence amidst media sources. This term captures how media become part of the environment all around us, transforming how we relate to one another in all aspects, from art to business, public politics to private family life. While any technology can have an effect on society, the change brought about by a change in media is especially profound because a medium serves as the form through which all aspects of culture are expressed, experienced, and practiced. It is already established that media has become a pervasive and ubiquitous feature of modern contemporary living, forming the building blocks of everyday life. It has fused the public with the private, the local and the global, and the individual with the collective. So intrinsic it is to our everyday lives that it has become invisible, in the sense that we become oblivious to these channels that shape our lives the most. The media has today has become the playground for a search of meaning and belonging, and not just by consumption, but also by producing a range of symbols and meanings. What has emerged is a culture of virtuality wherein reality itself is entirely captured by mediated communication. The essence of this claim is that media reflects and creates a particular culture, the participation in which is seldom voluntary. Communities and individuals are bombarded constantly with messages from a multitude of sources. And I think you'll all agree with me on this point. I'll just briefly talk about an approach to studying this mediated reality. Jean Baudrillard, a French media theorist, argued that the border between reality and representation has totally collapsed. We can no longer separate our representations from reality. He calls this hyperreality. Baudrillard argues that the media representations are in fact part of a hyperreal world and cannot be seen as separate from it. As the vast majority of people only ever know things via media representations of them, their reality is shaped, determined even by the media. Hyperreality is a world in which the ultimate guarantor of authenticity and reality is to be seen on TV and in the media. Baudrillard argues that in an age where the mass media are everywhere, in effect, a new reality, hyperreality, is created, composed of the intermingling of people's behavior and media images. The world of hyperreality is constructed of images which only get their meaning from other images and hence have no grounding in external reality. These messages promoted by the media promote not only products but moods, attitudes, and a sense of what is and what is not important. The media we use populate our environment of meanings. It is in this environment of meanings that we search for our sense of self, our sense of identity, and recognition. The potential of people to shape their lives and identities can be found in the assumption that people produce themselves and therefore each other in media. Therefore, media is not just about consumption, but also an active process of self determination. This perhaps may additionally explain why people do not recognize their media habits because they are constitutive part of them. Let's consider all those advertisements that speak of determining a woman's self worth in terms of how they look. For decades, beauty commercials have manipulated generations of women, me included, into hating their bodies and their outward appearances. Fat shaming, racist, and outright sexist advertisements in the media have long been the norm. In recent times, the narrative is changing with more advertisements stressing on body acceptance. But suffice to say that a lot needs to be still done in this regard. The messages the media offers often blurs the lines of distinction between the right from the wrong. Another example will help clarify this point. In 2015, a 32-year-old male of Indian origin living in Australia was accused of stalking multiple women. In court, the man pleaded guilty by saying that he was influenced by the Hindi film industry in India, also known as Bollywood. He said that he has always seen that the main lead in Bollywood got the women to say yes to him by relentlessly chasing them. He thought it was natural to do so in real life and did not realize that what he was doing was wrong. He was let go. As important it is to talk about the significance of media messages, it would, however, be incorrect to conceive individuals as hapless victims to this mediated culture. Doing this could make for a fragmented understanding of the issue. There are many approaches to studying the individual's relationship with media. I'll discuss a few of them in here to, in order to give a more rounded understanding of the role media plays in our contemporary lives. I'll begin by talking about the limited effects theory. This is a media theory proposed by Paul Lazarsfeld. This theory states that even if there is an effect created by the media on the thoughts and opinions of individuals, this effect is minimal at best or limited because people generally choose what to watch or read based on what they already believe. The media thus piles on their already well established worldview and thus can exert a negligible influence. This theory originated and was tested in the 1940s and 1950s. Studies that examined the ability of media to influence voting in elections found that well informed people relied more on personal experience, prior knowledge, and their own reasoning. Moreover, people's use of the mass media tends to reinforce their pre established ideas instead of changing them at times. Research has shown that in the US presidential elections, the overwhelming majority of individual votes can be accounted from attitudes such as party favoritism, measured even before the electoral campaign on media commenced. Voters already knew who they were voting for, and the media campaigns had negligible effect on their decisions. However, media like this theory also states that media texts are more likely to sway those who might be less informed. A key shortcoming of this theory, however, is the fact that it was formulated way back when the presence of media was not as widespread as it is today. Next, I'll move on to discussing the culturalist theory. Developed in the 1980s and the 1990s, this theory argues that people interact with media to create their own meanings out of the images and messages they receive. This theory sees audiences as playing an active rather than passive role in relation to mass media. Theorists emphasize that audiences choose what to watch among a wide range of options, choose how much to watch, and may also choose the mute button or the VCR remote over the programming selected by the network or cable station. Researchers find that when people approach material, whether written text or media messages or images, they interpret the material based on their own knowledge and experience. Thus, different groups explain the meaning of a particular text, media text, based on widely divergent interpretations based on age, gender, race, ethnicity, and religious background. Therefore, cultural theorists claim that personal perspective plays a more powerful role in how the audience members interpret those messages. The third theory, and the one that heavily follows the other ones, is the reception theory, propounded by Stuart Hall, which focuses on the way in which an audience's class and cultural background affects the way in which it makes sense for them to interpret a certain media text in a certain way. Some members of an audience may simply accept the preferred reading encoded in a text, such as a news bulletin, by its producer. This preferred reading, Hall argues, is likely to reflect the dominant or mainstream ideology. However, Hall argues that the understanding of a text also depends on the cultural and class background of the person interpreting it. Other members of an audience may take an oppositional reading of a text because their social position places them in conflict with the preferred reading. For example, a worker involved in strike action or a member of an ethnic minority is likely to take an oppositional reading of a text, such as a news story or industrial and or race relations, rather than accept the dominant reading encoded in the text by its producer. My motive behind discussing these theories was to provide an idea of how a simplistic understanding of the relationship between media output and the audience is just not enough. The audience plays a much more active role in determining the messages offered by the media. Audiences shape the media output rather than soaking up whatever comes their way. Now, having provided a background and some approaches to ground this analysis, I would now like to move on to the next part. Here, I take up a discussion on the positive effects of the media in our contemporary everyday lives. We all realize that the media has fundamentally changed information gathering in the present context. News all around the globe is now just a click away, especially with the onslaught of the social media platforms such as Twitter and Facebook. The process of knowledge production and dissemination has seemingly been revolutionized. Perhaps the biggest example of this has come from during the COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic has impacted the way journalists gather information, especially during the lockdown when everybody is mandated to stay indoors. In such a situation, many media professionals rely on social media and the internet to gather information. With field visits posing health risks, many journalists turn to social media to gather information. Interviews for these stories were conducted over WhatsApp, and ideas were picked from Facebook. The media have also played a pivotal role during the pandemic in another sense, especially in the use of visual data to disseminate information and promote public health campaigns. The online media platforms adopted visual graphs to release COVID-19 statistics that demonstrated the distribution, transmission, and the trend of this outbreak. Social media platforms educated people to take public health measures. And as one of the first countries hit by COVID 19, Singapore's successful response was benefited from the early action taken by the country via social media. But the media's most important function during the pandemic is, is its role in mitigating isolation. In these times characterized by increasing stress, anxiety, and isolation, the media platforms have promoted a sense of community that has provided respite from boredom and loneliness. Media consumption, research says, had shot up in the last 1 year, and studies have shown that each generation has adjusted to it differently. If ever the role of media in promoting feelings of community is pronounced, it is now. It enabled people to remain connected to their family. The pandemic has fundamentally changed the idea of a community, but the media has aided in retaining some semblance of it, however virtual. I would like to quickly touch upon the fact here that this does not in any way discount the fact that media is also an active agent in spreading false information and promoting panic during the initial days of the pandemic. Let us now turn our attention to some other positive aspects of the media in contemporary times. The media, especially social media, are being lauded for taking the fight towards inclusivity and equality a step further. We know that the social media promotes space for multiple voices to be heard and provides recognition to debates and dissenting opinions, voices that could not otherwise perhaps been heard in the traditional media. Social media has allowed people to develop a voice of advocacy. It reinforces a sense of belonging. This can be a very positive influence when exposed to the right outlets, especially for people who are struggling with acceptance. For example, for LGBTQ identifying youth who do not have access or cannot watch shows with queer characters out of fear of being outed or harassed at home, the social media has become a space for self acceptance. Platforms such as YouTube, TikTok, Tumblr, and Instagram are used to find friends and community. These spaces are perceived as judgment free zones that provide a sense of belonging and encouragement. This does not, however, mean that cyberbullying or harassment do not exist, but the role of the media as a source of refuge trumps its negative aspects in some ways. For queer youth to feel like they belong, they need to see, read, and hear the voices of others who look like them, who feel like them, who experience things like them, who experience the same identifying labels. The effects of the media in combating sexism and systemic racism have been widely talked about. The media provides a source of resistance to the dominant narrative that becomes important for assertion of minority identities. The most pertinent and most recent example of this is the way social media impacted the Black Lives Matter protests. Hashtag Black Lives Matter became prominent in the summer of 2013 when in Oakland, California, a labor organizer named Alicia Garza responded on her Facebook page to the acquittal of George Zimmerman, the man who gunned down Trayvon Martin. Since then, it has become the banner under which dozens of disparate organizations, new and old, and millions of individuals, loosely and tightly related, press for change. But it was with the killing of George Floyd that the movement reached New York heights. A research conducted by the Pew Research Center claimed that about 23% of social media users in the US have changed their opinions about issues of police brutality, police reforms after the Black Lives Matter protests. That is, they read stuff on social media that compelled them to change their opinions on police reforms and police brutality. The media enabled people from far and wide to be a part of the conversation of this movement. Yet another example can be made of the Me Too movement that enabled social media to take movements from an offline space to online space. When actor Alyssa Milano first used the Me Too hashtag following the allegations of sexual harassment against Harvey Weinstein, it was tweeted more than 12 million times. Within weeks, the hashtag became a movement. Women all over the world turned a private torment into a public crime. The sense of relief and solidarity as women spoke up through their social media accounts was palpable. The fact that we are still speaking about it, however, is also down to the role that the media has played over the time. Responding to hashtag MeToo, the media has not only added to the authority of the movement, but it has also amplified it. A report by the Women's Media Center in the US showed that the amount of coverage around sexual assault and abuse had significantly increased since the Milano tweet. It increased about 30%. What's more, the study found that stories beyond sexual harassment had also been given more prominence as a result of the Me Too movement. After October 2017, media began to more commonly write about issues that particularly pertain to women, such as reproductive health and the wage gap. From a women's perspective, hashtag MeToo has been the catalyst for the media to give voice to issues that were previously considered taboo in public discussion. The media makes a difference as we recalibrate and adjust, and our culture corrects itself to true gender equality. This being said, it also needs to be mentioned that the media is not perfect. In this next section, I would now like to take up a discussion on how the media is also riddled with its fair share of problems, touching upon issues such as political and corporate control, problematic representation, especially of minority identities, and the problem of media bias. It is largely known that the media reflects and projects the view of a minority elite which controls it. Those people who own and control the corporations that produce media comprise this elite. Advocates of this view concern themselves particularly with massive corporate mergers of media organizations, which limit competition and put big businesses at the reins of media, especially news media. The global media is now dominated by a small number of powerful corporations. The small scale, independent media companies have gradually been incorporated into highly centralized media conglomerates. The concern is that when ownership is restricted, a few people then have the ability to manipulate what people can see or hear. For example, owners can easily avoid or silence stories that might expose unethical corporate behavior or hold corporations responsible for their actions. The issue of sponsorship adds to this problem. Advertising money funds most media. Networks aim at programming the largest possible audience because the broader the appeal, the greater the potential of purchasing audience and the easier the easier it is to sell airtime to advertisers. Thus, news organizations may shy away from negative stories about corporations, especially parent corporations that finance large advertising campaigns in their newspapers or on their stations. If I might just briefly talk about my own personal experiences working as a journalist, I worked as a desk journalist for 2 years, and There is, like every other workplace, there is a hierarchy in which news travels. So whenever we would get briefing to write an article or an editorial, there would be some briefing that would be very clear on which topics to avoid. So suppose if there was a very it was an issue that looked that demanded introspection, we were asked to avoid that. If there was a topic that required to speak ill or speak against, not necessarily ill, to speak against the political authority, we were asked to not do that. So there is a lot of censorship that happens in the media before the news actually reaches the audience because of these broader socio-political processes that control the media. Like I was mentioning, complicating this is the problem of political control. In countries where the state has direct influence on what is to be broadcast, the media directly reflects whatever the government deems fit. Then everything happens according to the government's choices, or the ideology that is so propounded is what the government wants its people to understand. I'll talk here again about a bit of my own research experiences. I'm currently studying the comedy industry on the social media in India and its impact on marginalized communities. To provide some context to this issue, India is currently being governed by a party that is increasingly fascist in nature. Crackdown on free speech, dissent is the norm, with the consequences being far more severe for the marginalized communities. It's being said that we are currently going through a neo fascist regime. It has now reached a point where police complaints are being filed against people left, right, and center for hurting religious or political sentiments. During the course of my research, I uncovered that the government in India heavily controls what can be said and cannot be said about it. It exercises this control through strict censorship rules on television and radio, and it monitors the content that comes out of these sources. But the internet poses a challenge. With its relatively relaxed rules, the internet in India allows for a multiplicity of voices to be heard. I'm studying comedy on the internet, and comedy by its very nature is a force of resistance. But I realized that even stand-up comedy in India has not been able to achieve its full potential of becoming a force of resistance because of the retaliation by the very right-wing government. In the past, live comedy shows have often been stalled by goons and religious fanatics. Online rape threats and death threats have been issued to comics. It's stand-up comedy, which is supposedly not to be taken seriously, has also irked a lot of political sentiments in the country. Recently, the government in India has declared that it would monitor the content being developed on the internet and other streaming platforms, thus ensuring that its surveillance techniques reaches these relatively free spaces. So essentially, it means that there are no free spaces to voice alternate opinions in India right now. The point that I'm trying to make is that the media is seldom free from bias. It may reflect corporate worldviews and also opinions that the government wants its people to hear. Thus, despite its democratizing potential, the media is firmly ensconced in the dominant ideology. As much as the media offers space for articulating alternate opinions, it also discriminates. Over the course of the next few minutes, I would like to walk you through some aspects of media's discriminatory techniques. Let us first talk about representation. The issue of representation in media is a hotly contested topic. Media representations are not the sole cause of discrimination or exclusion of minorities from mainstream societies. Nevertheless, stereotypical representations can reinforce existing negative ideas of social groups, and in doing so can be seen as part of the wider social problem. Perhaps it would be helpful to take an example from the Canadian sociopolitical context. As far as Indigenous issues are concerned, or as far as my understanding of Canadian media's portrayal of Indian Indigenous issues are concerned, I have largely read literature that has said that the Canadian media's approach is largely problematic. Mainstream news coverage in Canada has largely been characterized by an obliteration of Indigenous perspectives. The lack of representation is compounded by a culture, excuse me, by a culture of misinformation that often perpetrates indifference about indigenous issues in the dominant discourse. News articles mostly resort to homogenization of indigenous identities in the name of inclusion. What this essentially does is breed misinformation and misconceptions about problems plaguing indigenous communities. A reason behind this, scholars argue, could be that there is not enough indigenous representation in the newsrooms. Resultantly, pertinent issues get sidetracked. On closer inspection, it becomes apparent that the frames used by the media to talk about a particular topic. By frames, I mean the precise manner in which the media channels arrange a story, the narrative they offer to a story. They decide who the victim is going to be, who the hero is going to be, is quite politically motivated. Overall, this lack of representation is more than just a political issue. It has far reaching consequences on individual self determination and collective self determination. Over time, it leads to a devaluation of self worth. However, this occurrence is not restricted to the Canadian media's portrayal of Indigenous issues, but also extends to other countries in various forms. The media actively colludes with the state to suppress alternate opinions, minority voices. A tool used in this regard is that of language. Often, the media uses language that actively discriminates against marginalized communities. Take, for example, the imposition of English as the primary language of communication. Um, just the fact that most media houses demand a conversation in English fails to take into cognizance the reality that many do not know English or do not have the resources to learn this language. This is a common occurrence in various parts of the world where media houses use English to convey their opinions without realizing that many do not know languages other than their regional languages. Language then becomes a politically motivated tool by the help of which the media consolidates ideas. There are also instances in which the media have used very insensitive language while talking about sensitive topics. I was once studying this newsroom debate, which was talking about systemic racism. This was in India. And throughout, they are trying to understand how systemic racism is a problem by continuously referring to dark skin tone in extremely racist terms, which was interesting and deeply problematic, to say the least. This brings me to the last bit of my analysis, where I will talk about the far reaching consequences of media. In this instance, I'll talk about the negative consequences of media. I'll borrow from the recent incident at Capitol Hill in the US. The very unfolding of events last Wednesday at the Capitol Hill in the US is evidence of the extent of the destruction media is capable of doing. In an unprecedented step last week, Facebook and Twitter suspended Donald Trump from posting to their platforms after a mob of his supporters stormed the House of Congress. It was the most aggressive action either company has yet taken against Trump, who more than a decade ago embraced the immediacy and scale of Twitter to rally loyalists, castigate enemies, and spread false rumors. However, experts have opined that the social media is complicit in this because Trump has repeatedly used this form of media to incite violence. It's a culmination of years of propaganda and abuse of media by the President of the United States. Over the course of Trump's presidency, Facebook and Twitter rewrote their policies to give the president more runway to say dangerous things under the guise that it was important for the public to know. These policies were clearly designed around Trump's online behavior and gave him the freedom to spread messages of hate, conspiracy, and violence. At best, those policies simply enabled Trump's lies and calls for violence. At worst, they let those dangerous messages go viral and be believed by enough people who were willing to break down the doors of the Capitol. Suspending his account now is perhaps doing too little, too late. These conspiracies, it is believed, began from the dark corners of the internet and found their way into major social platforms and were spread by the president across his social accounts, creating a loop of false and dangerous information that fed on itself. This incident goes on to demonstrate the power of media, especially social media, in everyday public and private lives. As much as it can act as a source of community bonding and collective resistance and venting, it can simultaneously also become a hotbed of discriminatory practices and violent retributive actions. The idea is not to give precedence to one function over the other, but to realize media in all its potential. This brings me to the end of my presentation. My motive tonight was to provide some insight into a few of the issues in media and contemporary society with the help of some examples. I completely acknowledge and reiterate that the issues I raised are far from exhaustive. And I would like to end this presentation by thanking everyone who attended and, more importantly, stayed till the end. Thank you for being a wonderful audience. I would like to end this presentation by thanking Mr. Farley Cates and all the organizers at the Center for Inquiry Canada for giving me an opportunity to talk about this topic tonight. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Shreyashi. That was a very, very interesting presentation. I personally have about 6 or 7 questions here, but what we like to do is open it up for questions and comments. I have a couple I wouldn't mind mentioning right now, especially pertaining to the last part of your presentation. One thing is, you talk about the various platforms, and it seems to me that advertising we know advertising dictates content. They control the strings. So they're the puppet masters with the media. We also know that these platforms, these social media platforms, exist purely as a vehicle for advertising. Whether you equate advertising to brainwashing or what have you, advertising. So I guess inadvertently what Twitter might end up doing is just forcing the emergence of other platforms, which will just be additional platforms for more and more advertising. More advertising there is, the more our brains turn to mush, it seems. So just thought maybe you could comment a bit on that, more the role of advertising. And the other thing too, when you talk about the Canadian context, one thing that's a big concern of ours is what's been happening on First Nations and in Indigenous communities. The media has spent so much time concentrating on wherever there's, wherever First Nations are putting up barricades, for example, on their lands, protests, they'll concentrate on that. But something as basic as lack of drinkable or potable water has been ignored. It's hardly been addressed by the media. So something that the media could have a role in helping to change, to bring more to the public's attention, they've ignored. And what they've instead done is taken up their time concentrating on what's sensational, on corporate interests. So maybe a couple comments in that regard, and then like to open it up for any other questions.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll begin with the second point first. I think the main reason why, and I completely agree with you, the reason why I did not comment so much because I don't exactly know the range of the thing, so it would be inappropriate for me to comment on it. But yes, as far as I have understood, the reason why the media shies away from talking about topics which are indigenous is because they are a minority community. So doing so would not be in the interest of, like you say, financial interest, and not it wouldn't bring in the big bucks. So I would say that there is a, like I said, the lack of representation does not only mean that there are no indigenous news reporters. It means that in every step of the way there is no practically discussion about indigenous issues or anything. Like I was reading this article that talked about how the media has handled the issue of missing and murdered women in India, and it was deeply problematic because the worst part is that they it's like a homogenization of these identities. They do not really etch out the differences or the fact that there are many communities at stake here. So it's like a lumping together of many things together, and just getting it out of the way. As far as your first comment on the advertisement, I would say that this is where I started out by distinguishing between the traditional and the new media. So the traditional media came to like television, news, the the newspapers. It is largely engineered by advertisement. That is where the new media came in, trying to be a more interactive space, which opened up spaces for people's voices to be heard, and a more democratic space, if I might put it that way. But um like I would say that the new media, like social media platforms, I would say, Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, it offers a space for alternate voices to be heard. But the current problem is that these are also being appropriated by the big corporations. So advertisement has also seeped in into these seemingly relatively free spaces. So it's now all coming together under this one big umbrella of you know of media imperialism, if I might call it that. So yeah. So
Okay, thank you. I guess I'm just wondering if you could comment on what I've been observing with the, and I'm glad you raised that term hyper reality, because it's a new type of propaganda tool. And I'm wondering, with so many media sources, I mean, people are just getting hit with, I mean, relative to even 10 years ago, it's absolutely ridiculous. And I have my favorite ones I like watching, and I try and sort through the various biases. And I have more of a very much a left-leaning bias myself. So that's what I'm trying to concentrate on. But with the multiple media sources and their constant bombardment, is it starting to really diffuse the differences among or between certain sectors in society? For example, I look at the way the media talks about what went on last Wednesday with a neo-fascist mob rule, and then look at how they view that vis-a-vis how they view, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement or the Antifa movement, that the lines, the differences are being so diffused that people are just looking at the whole thing, and your typical American audience is looking at it and saying, well, they're all the same, so what the hell.
just to add to this, a very interesting narrative has come up from India, to be very honest. So, like, what? So in India right now, there's a very huge farmers' protest that has been going on because, like I said, the very right wing government has introduced a farmers bill, which does a lot of injustice to the farmers. So since I think November, if I'm not mistaken, like a lot of farmers are protesting on the streets in what is like India's one most brutal winter. So when there is a lot of animosity already in India, political animosity already in India, Indian people who support the right wing government have come out in support of Trump, saying that his account should not have been suspended because this is right to free speech. Whereas they are jailing farmers left, right, and center every day. Farmers who are peacefully protesting. So the differences between the events that unfolded at Capitol Hill last Wednesday, they're lumping them two together, saying that this is not different from that, whereas they're completely different things for completely different political motives. One is about a rightful peaceful protest for farmers bill, and the other was essentially an act of terrorism incited by a very politically violent president. So they are just, so the right wingers are just fusing them two together, saying no, they're the same thing. What is happening is wrong.
Okay, yeah, good. Well, on that basis, let me thank you, Shreyashi, for a very, very informative, very enlightening presentation.